welcome and thank you for joining us today for this ADCET webinar. My name is Darren Britton and I am the National Assistive Technology Officer with the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training. That is ADCET for short. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a white male in my mid-50s, wrong side of mid-50s maybe, with greying blonde hair, no longer strawberry blonde, more to the grey side, and I'm wearing a blue check shirt and blue rimmed glasses. Just to note that today's webinar is being live captioned, and to activate the captions you can click on the CC button in the Zoom toolbar that's located either at the top or the bottom of your screen. We also have live captions available via a browser if you choose to access them that way, which will be added to the chat box now, and you can use that link. ADCET is hosted on Lutruwita, that is Tasmanian Aboriginal land, and in the spirit of reconciliation, ADCET respectfully acknowledges the Lutruwita nations and also recognises the Aboriginal history and culture of the land, and we pay respects to elders past and present and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status. I'd also like to acknowledge all other countries and lands from participants in this webinar and also acknowledge their elders and ancestors and their legacy towards us and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us for this webinar today. This webinar is Barriers Before Entry, Improving Pre-Admission Guidance for University Applicants with Disability or for Disabled University Applicants, and we'll get to that, which will be presented by Laura Gray, a winner of an ADCET 2025 Accessibility in Action Award, so the name may be familiar to you, and Bryony McNeill. And they will highlight gaps in their presentation between inclusive policy and everyday practice around pre-admission. They will also be identifying practical opportunities to create clearer, safer, and more inclusive pre-admission communication for our students. But before we begin, a few more housekeeping details. This webinar, as I said, is being captioned by our lovely Sharon from Captify It Live and will be recorded. The recording of this will be available on the ADCET website shortly in the coming days. The presentation today will run for around 45 to 50 minutes or so. Then at the end, there will be a 10-minute break or section for questions. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the chat box with us and with each other, but please remember to choose everyone so that everybody can read what you have to say. Laura and Bryony are happy to answer any questions you may have at the end of the presentation. If you have a question that you would like asked, please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. That way we can consolidate them all into one place. Another thing that we'd ask is feel free to use the reaction emojis during the presentation if you feel so inclined, as this is a great way to provide some visual feedback to the presenters who cannot see you while they're presenting. These reactions can be found under the React button in your Zoom toolbar as well. So with all of that out of the way, let me pass over to Laura and Bryony for their presentation today. So over to you, Laura.
Thanks so much, Darren. Hi, everyone. My name's Laura. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a middle-aged Caucasian woman with blonde hair, wearing black today, and I'm really happy to be here.
And hello from me. My name's Bryony. I also use she, her pronouns. I'm also a middle-aged white woman wearing black today, and it's a privilege to be here presenting to you.
Thanks, Bryony. So today we're going to be chatting about an aspect of our courses in higher education that we can too easily overlook, which really shapes the experiences of disabled students before they even become students. And if you're like us, up until quite recently, we didn't really think about our course website that much, other than checking the details that were factually correct. But we've come to realise that course web pages and the other information that we provide to prospective applicants is often the first insight that they have into the culture and the practices of our course. And when our course information is unwelcoming or exclusionary, we're sometimes putting up barriers to disabled students before they even step foot in the door. And what we hope we'll leave you with today is some practical steps that you could take to address these barriers before entry.
So first like to acknowledge that both Laura and I are joining this webinar from Wadawurrung country, which is pictured here on the slide. We're showing a sunrise over a beautiful part of the coast near to Geelong, which is where we're located at Deakin University. I pay respects to elders past and present and extend those respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining our webinar today. As we come together to discuss disability access and inclusive education, I really want to recognise the deep knowledge and leadership of First Nations peoples in this space and their ongoing contributions to learning and teaching, which have taken place here on these lands for many thousands of years. I really hope our conversation today can be guided by that tradition of knowledge sharing and community. And so like all projects, this one was very much a team effort, and it's important to acknowledge all of the contributors to this work, whose names we have listed here on the slide. We come from a range of different institutions across Australia and Aotearoa, and we share a deep commitment to inclusive education, and we take a disability affirming approach in our work. So our group includes higher education and health professions, leaders and researchers and education. Some of our group have lived experience of disability, and some are carers of disabled people. We recognise that our positionality as educators and that insider status as university staff members can shape the way that we have approached our work. And before we move into the main presentation, I really wanted to make note of the language that we'll be using in this webinar. So we're primarily using identity first language as we move through the presentation, although we may also use person first language at times. We acknowledge that language preferences are deeply personal, and we do recognise that the terms that we're using may not reflect everyone's preferred terminology. Okay, so we're going to start our discussion today by introducing our fictional student, Ashley, who's pictured on the screen. She's a young woman sitting in a library somewhere working on her computer. Although Ashley is fictional, her experiences are very real for many people who are exploring their options for studying at university. So Ashley's 17, she's in year 12, and she's thinking about next year and feeling that usual mix of excitement and some nerves that go along with that transition from school to university. Ashley also lives with a chronic illness, so some days her energy levels are pretty high, but on other days her symptoms can flare up and she manages fatigue, chronic pain, and sometimes a need to rest unpredictably. She knows from her experiences at high school that she's going to need some flexibility around attendance, deadlines, and maybe assessment formats when she gets to university. Ashley knows that she can succeed academically, and she really wants to find out which university is going to support her to thrive in her studies. So as we move through the webinar today, we're going to come back and check in with Ashley and accompany her as she navigates that process of choosing which university she's going to study at next year.
Thanks, Bryony. So we'll keep Ashley in mind as we explore this project, and we'll, as Bryony said, we'll come back to her. And I think it's safe to say that I'm probably preaching to the converted when we say to this particular audience that at the core of this work is the recognition that all students have a right to access inclusive tertiary education, and that we should be upholding that in everything that we do. However, we also have a focus on health professions education, in particular medical education. And again, maybe it's self-evident, but we really need a health workforce that is reflective of the community, including disabled practitioners. And yes, this is important because everyone has a right to both education and a meaningful career, but also because we know that there are significant disparities in health outcomes for disabled community members. And if we can increase the representation of disabled people in the healthcare workforce, we might be better equipped to address that gap. So what are we actually talking about here? So if we really truly value that principle of including students with a disability and ensuring that they thrive, we actually need to look across all stages of the student life cycle. And the image that's currently on screen is a model of what we mean by a whole of student life cycle approach. This model is reasonably complex, so bear with me a little bit, but it encompasses many different elements of course design, delivery, organisation and management. And at the centre of this flower-shaped diagram is disability inclusion, what we're trying to achieve. And proximal to that are some foundational aspects of tertiary education, including the educational culture, staff capabilities, and policy and governance. And beyond this, the petals of the flower, we can see the sequential steps in a student journey, starting from when our students might be just thinking about tertiary education, all the way through admission, teaching, assessment, through to graduation and beyond. And we can use each of these points in the diagram to prompt us to reflect on where we currently stand and where we might like to get to. Ideally, though, disability inclusion will be a consideration at all points in that cycle. But it's also important to think about where to start. And a good place to start is at the start. And that start of the student life cycle is at the point of where we're marketing courses and sharing information about those courses with people who are not actually yet our students, but who are prospective students. And then thinking about how we support them to make decisions about where they're going to apply. And for this work, we focused on medical courses because that's where we've been working, but also because we know that many thousands of people apply to medical school every year in Australia and Aotearoa, and the stakes are really high for those applicants. But first, we're just going to go back to our student, Ashley.
So yeah, let's come back and check in with Ashley. She set aside an afternoon to explore some university websites to try and find out which one might be the best fit for her. So she sits down at her laptop, opens up the main web page for 3 different universities which are located in her home state and starts to look at what she can find on those websites. Before I get into describing the websites, I just wanted to flag that while these are based on real data, these are fictional universities, which are a conglomeration of data that we've gathered from different sources. So looking at the first web page, Ashley finds that it looks pretty nice. It's polished, interface is easy to read, but as she starts to explore a bit further into the website and she specifically wants to look for some information about disability support, Ashley starts to struggle to find anything that feels really relevant to her circumstances. So there is a page on disability services, but it mainly describes support for mobility, vision, or hearing-related access needs. She can't find any mention of chronic illness. There isn't any reference to fluctuating symptoms or flexible attendance. The language feels a little bit vague and it's quite generic. Ashley also isn't really clear on who she can contact from that university to get a bit more information. She then moves on to the next website from our second fictional university. This university has a lot of information. Actually, there's pages and pages of policy documents, forms, detailed procedures, and multi-step processes. There's a lot there, but it's quite exhausting to sift through. Ashley feels a bit overwhelmed, but she does manage to find an email address for the disability support team. She makes a note to email the team, but she is a little bit worried about whether contacting them prior to her enrolment could have any implications for her application and her likelihood of being successful in being accepted to her chosen course. She also does wonder how she would manage to keep up with her studies at this university if she's already struggling just to navigate their website. Next, Ashley opens the website for the third university. On this website, the main homepage has a link which takes her directly to another page entitled Accessibility and Inclusion Support. The page that opens is really clear and she finds it easy to navigate. It speaks to a wide range of disabilities, including chronic illness. And what Ashley finds is that it explains some really important information in plain language. So things like, what is a learning access plan? How can adjustments support students with fluctuating needs? And it also provides some examples of flexibility options. So modified attendance requirements or extended timeframes for learning and assessment. It also explains how to book an appointment with the team and gives an indication of what to expect from that meeting. The information is written in a warm and respectful tone. Ashley feels a sense of relief, and she immediately feels like she would feel quite welcome at this university. So even though these three universities are fictional, we know that Ashley's experience is quite reflective of what we found when we started gathering data from real universities as part of this project. So let's now imagine that Ashley's interested in attending your university and she's opened up your university's website on her laptop. What do you think her experience might be? Would it feel welcoming? Is the website easy to navigate? Would she be able to find those contact details and get in touch with someone for more information? So let's find out. I now invite you to have a look at your own institution's website if you're able to do so, and imagine that you are in the position of Ashley or another prospective student who's thinking about coming to study with you next year. And we'll just give you a couple of minutes to look at your websites and see what your first impressions are. If you want to pop any of your observations in the chat, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, we hope to have some time at the end where we can have some discussion. And I really want to emphasize here that the intention of this activity is not to name and shame any particular university or institutions, but really just to encourage you to take a step back and think about that very first interaction that a prospective student might have when they're considering attending your university. So in most cases, that's going to involve looking at that public-facing website. So please go ahead and take 2 minutes to have a look at your websites and see how you go.
So I suppose in the interests of time, we will keep moving, but I think this is a really useful exercise to do, and we really want you to be thinking about how you might apply some of what we're talking about today to your own institutional web pages, and even more specifically at the level of course pages. So any courses that you're associated with, what does that actually look like? And I'm guessing that some of you found some really useful and welcoming information on the website that you looked at, but I'm also guessing, and perhaps it seems in the chat, that some of you didn't. And that's certainly been our experience. So for the study that we conducted, we ran an audit of the public-facing websites of all 23 medical schools across Australia and Aotearoa. We asked several questions of each website, starting with the language regarding disability that each used, whether relevant information was easy to find, whether it was clear, whether applicants needed to disclose anything regarding disability, and how they were provided with information about the requirements of the course. And all of this is really critical information that applicants need prior to applying to a medical program. So what did we find? Now, on the table I'm about to share, I purposefully removed the text so that you can focus on the colours. And think of this as a heat map, where the darker blue colours are domains where we rated schools more highly. And so essentially what we'd like to see, or the ideal situation, is that each of the 23 schools listed along the left-hand side is dark blue across all of the columns. We'd like to see a whole page of blue. But as you can see, that wasn't exactly what we found. Excuse me. And there are some schools who have quite a bit of dark blue there and high ratings, but there's also quite a lot of white and lighter colours where the ratings were much lower. So it's fair to say that some schools did well in some of the domains, but every school, and ours included, had room for improvement. So I'm just going to focus on some of the particular elements of our results. And there is a bit of text on these slides, but if you'd prefer not to read, then that's fine, because I'll be going through them verbally. A key area was the language used regarding disability on course websites, and this table shows the ratings that we gave on the left with a definition and example on the right. And I'll just note that these aren't taken word for word from any particular website. These are synthesized examples. So what we actually found was that on many of the medical school websites, disability wasn't mentioned at all. The word disability itself didn't appear on either the course page or any of the linked pages, particularly those related to admissions. And instead, there were general statements, perhaps around the use of inherent requirements or information that will help you work out whether you're suited to pursue this degree, but there's no explicit mention of disability. We also saw many pages where disability was really only mentioned in the context of a deficit. And there were often statements like this one, which states that students with disabilities might not be able to complete their program if they can't meet the essential requirements. In contrast, a smaller group of courses framed disability in a positive light, and many of these made an affirmative statement around their desire to explicitly include students with a disability, making commitments to inclusivity or encouraging applications from students with disabilities, and then also referencing the need for students to understand the course and providing information regarding support services. And if you think back to our student Ashley, I suspect you'll agree that she might feel quite differently reading these different websites. What we also found was that the requirements of courses were generally presented in one of two ways. One focused on how students undertake tasks. And there's a paraphrased example here. Good gross motor skills are essential for performing healthcare tasks efficiently and safely. These skills include lifting, carrying, pushing, pulling, standing, twisting, and bending. What's really striking here is the very explicit nature of these requirements and how little room there is for adaptation or adjustment. There's no mention at all of doing things in different ways or using supportive technologies or assistance to achieve these tasks. And of course, every higher education institution has a legal responsibility to provide adjustments to their courses to enable students with disabilities to undertake them. But that's just not visible in this example of an inherent requirement or an information statement that uses this kind of framing. And a student with a particular disability reading this might not see themselves in this phrasing and might not see that they've got the capability to take this course and might elect not to apply. As a contrast, other courses describe their requirements in a way that was focused on the outcome of tasks, why tasks need to be done, what the purpose of the task is, rather than the way in which the student does the task. And here that's gathering information, performing procedures, assisting in an emergency. It's the why rather than the how. And in the context of a medical course, this would encompass interacting with a patient, perhaps using text-to-speech to ask questions, using a digital stethoscope to listen to their chest, or giving directions to a colleague during a resuscitation. And this approach is really different. It allows students or potential students to identify where they could potentially employ accommodations or assistive technologies, and it's a much more inclusive approach. What we also identified is that some schools were much better than others at informing applicants about what steps they could or should take next. Some schools just didn't provide any information, which we rated, obviously, at the bottom of the scale for clarity and transparency. Others suggested that applicants take a look at the information provided and reach out to the university. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't find that hugely helpful or welcoming. Which part of this massive organisation should I reach out to? What's the email address or the phone number? And what should I say to the person that I reach? Other courses were a bit clearer, noting that making contact before applying might help applicants decide what courses will best suit them and to better understand what adjustments or supports might be available. But only the highest rated courses made it clear to potential applicants whether or not they had to make contact with a course prior to application. Often applicants were told that they should reach out, or they were encouraged to discuss their circumstances. But very rarely was it acknowledged that an applicant with a disability might not be willing or comfortable disclosing their circumstances. And almost never was it made completely clear that disclosure of a disability would not impact on whether an applicant would be accepted into the program. And this is really important in the highly competitive context of medical programs, but it's important for all applicants with disability to understand that when they disclose their personal information, what's going to happen to that information and how is it going to be used? So our key findings, unfortunately, as we've seen, no medical school has scored consistently well across all domains, including our own. But we undertook this work, this analysis, a little while ago now, and I think things are already changing because this work identified many areas where relatively minor adjustments to language or accessibility of information could actually have a big impact. Simply labelling information as being relevant to applicants with a disability and using non-technical and non-discipline specific language would be really helpful, for example. So we found many areas where things could be done differently, but what we've also seen is that change is possible. And many of these adjustments don't need major restructuring of course information. In our own institution, I've been able to work with course teams across our faculty to review course web pages, and in most cases make fairly small tweaks to language, which could actually have a really big shift in the experience of disabled applicants. To do this, we've leveraged regular review processes, sometimes accreditation processes, or internal formal review processes, but sometimes just those regular cycles of annual page updates. So those little changes of phrasing or provision of contact details at the right point, clarity around confidentiality, all of these adjustments could have a really significant impact.
So let's return to Ashley and see what the next steps in her university journey might look like. Just in the previous slide, Laura highlighted some small achievable changes that she was able to implement at our institution. And earlier we invited you to have a quick look at your own websites from that perspective of an incoming student. So was there anything that stood out, maybe some simple improvements that you noticed already that could be something you might be able to implement? Even just some small changes could potentially make quite a big difference for a prospective student such as Ashley. I think what I've noticed is that most of us have some really excellent support services and inclusive learning practices in place at our various institutions. But students can only benefit from these if they're able to get past those initial hurdles of navigating enrollment and actually come into our courses. So we realize it can be quite hard to know where to start sometimes. So to help you with this process, we've put together a list of reflective questions, which might help you to identify where you're doing well and maybe where there could be some room for improvement. And we'll go through these now. So our first question is around the ease of finding information. So in higher education, we're often very guilty of using jargon and having lots of language that can be quite difficult to understand, especially for people who are coming in without that experience of university and maybe without family members or friends who've navigated that enrollment process. So as Laura touched on, one of the things you could look at is whether your course requirements and the key assessment information are written in plain language for prospective students to understand. So I'm from medicine. We're particularly guilty of having lots of complicated language. So just an example, instead of saying something about your medical course like students must demonstrate OSCE competency, meet WIL prerequisites, and fulfill the program's threshold learning outcomes, we could communicate that same information in a much more straightforward way. So something like, as part of this program, students take part in practical learning activities, including supervised clinical simulations and workplace experiences. That's going to give applicants a much clearer understanding of what the course entails and also what might be expected of them as a student in that course. And that could help guide a conversation about possible support needs for that student as well. And so our next question is quite straightforward, but nonetheless, it's really important. So in this question, we ask whether prospective applicants can gain access to all the information that they need through that public-facing website, so before they actually apply. And one of the things we found in our research is that sometimes the information is locked behind university logins. So there might be some great information and support services there, but unless you're already established in that institution, you can't actually access them. So that's another quite easy thing to check, is whether or not you can access all of that information as an external party. And our third question, and just noting too, we do have these reflective questions in a document for you to take away and use, which hopefully will be a helpful resource. So the next question, we're really thinking about some other small steps that can make quite a big difference to the applicant's experience. And in this question, we ask whether there's a clear process for applicants to follow, including the details of an actual person that they can contact if they need further information. So I'm sure we've all had that experience of going onto a website and searching around, trying to find the right person to contact. And then if we found the person's name, trying to find their email address or their phone number to actually get in touch with them. It can be quite frustrating and really time consuming if this information's not readily available, or if it's out of date and you end up with a broken link or somebody that's not there anymore.
And so the other thing that we need to think about is whether we say really explicitly and really clearly to applicants that if they reach out for more information, that they aren't compromising their chances of getting into a course. As we've acknowledged, that's particularly important for competitive courses like medicine, but I think it applies across the board. It's important that applicants know that we will treat these discussions as confidential and separate to admissions processes. And importantly, that they'll be empowered to make choices for themselves with the support of the institution. And are we completely transparent in stipulating whether and when they might have to disclose disability, and if that's the case in your context? And conversely, what the possible benefits of disclosure might be? Why might it be useful for applicants to reach out to the institution before they apply? And often it's the case that that conversation is a really rich source of information for students or for applicants that helps them make informed choices, that helps them get a read on the perspectives and the practices of the institution. And those conversations, or that information provision step, is a really important process before students apply. And I think this last point is particularly important. If a potential applicant does reach out for further information or to discuss their circumstances, who will they be speaking to? Will that person or that team have the knowledge and the skills and the appropriate perspective to respond to their inquiry in a welcoming and informed manner? Do they have the resources and time to manage those queries? And will queries go to the Disability Support Centre, who've got that really deep understanding of adjustments? Or will inquiries go to the course team, who can really understand the course deeply? Who is best equipped in your context to talk to students or applicants about both the requirements of the course and future career pathways as well? And the answers to these questions will really vary depending on the course context, the institutional context, and the resources available within the different units. In our institution, many initial inquiries are directed to prospective student advisors who've got broad information across courses, but also who know who to refer more complex cases to. And importantly, course teams are getting much better at planning ahead to support these conversations, making sure that the right staff have the right training, the right understanding of the legislation, the right contacts within the disability support team to be able to have constructive conversations with potential applicants. So I think we've covered quite a few topics in this. If you'd like to know more of the detail behind this work, there's a QR code on screen which will link you to the publication that details this work. And we also have that handy one-pager which you'll be receiving, which contains the reflective questions that we've just outlined, and which the amazing ADCET team are going to share on our behalf. I know we've covered quite a lot here, but hopefully we've left you with the message that the first things that we can do to ensure that the first encounters that prospective students with our courses are positive, and that's so important. But there are often really simple things that we can do to ensure that those encounters don't create barriers for students before they even join us. And we're, of course, very happy to answer any questions now. And you're, of course, very welcome to reach out to us to continue the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Bryony. Look, I might just jump in while people have a bit of a think, because there was a lot of, really good practical information in there. So if anybody does have a question, please put that into the Q&A. I've got a couple, so I might just quickly start here. And one of those around the practical, I suppose, aspects. Through your research, was there some examples that you saw that stood out? They seem so simple, but they stood out as clear examples of that's a bit of really good practice that's there. And I know you've woven that into some of those questions and reflective parts there, where you go, I wonder why somebody chose to mention it that way, or not use acronyms, or not do this, and what effect has it had?
Yeah. I mean, I think an important point to note here is, yes, we're focusing on students with a disability here, but I think there's an accessibility component to this for all students. Every student coming into a tertiary program needs to understand what they're signing up for. And so not using jargon, using clear language, that discipline-specific terminology or higher education-specific terminology, some of that stuff is really dense and really inaccessible. And so I think reviewing our course pages and all of the information that we provide to prospective applicants with that in mind, I think is potentially really powerful. But the other thing I think I'd highlight is that clear message of welcome. Something in that encounter has to say to the prospective student, you are welcome here. We welcome you. We welcome a diverse range of people. However it's phrased, it's that message of welcome is so critical.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I don't think we probably do enough of that. We've become so used to these systems happening, enrollment period after enrollment period, that we just think they're set and forget, and we know what they're doing now. Did you come across any examples that had, sorry, to my next question, that actually had students' lived experience and some prior students talking about being a student at the institution and why this process and how to go through this process, and how that it can, as you said, feel overwhelming, but there are support mechanisms there for a reason. Our institutions want you to succeed. They want you to get into the course that you're looking for in the best way possible. So to help with that journey, that it's not this very sterile kind of environment. Did you find any that, were doing that well, I suppose, that stood out for the student voice being embedded in the application?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, not so much. And maybe that's another simple tip for people to take away, that, working with students and their stories are so powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's more that, institutions in general could do to illustrate student stories, just to show what really is possible, and also to show educators what's possible as well. Because sometimes, educators can lose sight of that as well. And sometimes I've certainly seen, and I understand it, the response is, oh, that's hard, or how is that going to work? But there are so many examples of great practice, great collaborative relationships that have been established between students and educators and institutions where people have thrived. And so we should be celebrating that, and we should be making those evident across the sector, ideally. But I think that's definitely a gap, and it's something that would probably speak to that idea of welcoming people.
Yeah. And we've stunned everybody. They don't have questions, or they're still thinking, "Oh, here we go. We've got one." I'll quickly get to that in a moment, because while I'm thinking of it, I'd just like to recap on the disclosure, and what happens with that information and what happens if I disclose. I've heard recently, even from some family members that have enrolled, that thought if I declare that I have a disability, or if I do this in the process, this means that I have to go off to counselling, or that I have to do this, or I'm completely unfamiliar with what's going to happen with this information. Why should I disclose? Because it's a really fearful thing to be doing, is saying, will I now get into this course? Will I now be accepted into this? Or what does this actually mean, and what happens with that information? This can be a real powerful barrier.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. And if you really think through the detail of the student life cycle, there are so many points or potential points of disclosure, and sometimes we don't always recognize them as such. It's easy to put on your website, reach out for more information, or come and have a chat if you want more information. But what we actually have to think is that that's potentially a disclosure. A student or a potential student is sharing information about themselves there. And I think being really transparent about that at every point where it might be necessary or required, if that's the case in your context, I think is so, so important. And that's how we establish trust, how we establish that trusting relationship with applicants and with students, without which you can't really have that good collaborative relationship of putting things in place to allow people to thrive.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to saying that the assumptions that we make, that they understand what we're talking about or what this means. We need to be really clear and careful in what we put there, and not information overload as well. We've got a question here from Jessie, and that is, where do inherent requirements fit into the application process, and should IRs be available on all course pages, and how best could you communicate these as clearly and concisely as possible? That's a very big question, Jessie.
It really is. And inherent requirements are a bit of a fraught area, I think it's fair to say. And we've kind of, for the purposes of this presentation, we've kind of not focused too much on inherent requirements because of that contention. Essentially, though, at the core of the original intention of inherent requirements was providing good, clear information to prospective students. So if we can do that, it doesn't have to be through an inherent requirement. There's lots of other ways to do that. And I think a lot of institutions and a lot of courses are moving away from inherent requirements. In the medicine space, some great work was done a couple of years ago to put together a kind of consensus guidance document, which was intended to allow courses to move away from inherent requirements. And it provides a set of reflective questions that applicants can look at and think about for themselves, thinking about, okay, well, this is what the course is going to ask of me. Does that fit my expectations and my needs and my priorities, and what accommodations might work for me in this context? And it can't provide all of the information, but it's a really good starting point for conversations. And I think it's where those conversations with individuals that are where the real substance of it are. Inherent requirements, I think, sometimes have been used in ways that go beyond that provision of information to prospective applicants, and sometimes have been used as ways to effectively put up barriers to access or barriers to progression for students. And that's where things get a little bit more complicated. But if we're focusing on that pre-admission space, there's lots of ways of communicating clearly and having pathways for conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the most important things we can do in that space. As you said, there's a lot of work going on, but to have it as a conversation starter, let's have that conversation. Let's try and alleviate your concerns, any course issues that may be there, any other potential barriers this might represent in the track, and what we can do about it. And if all of those things fail, then it might look at a barrier that can't do. Bryony.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think on the websites, even where there are inherent requirements, you can have that context around them, rather than some websites where there's just a link. Click here's the inherent requirements. And even the term inherent requirements is, quite specific, and it's not something that people coming in are going to know what that means.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's partly that framing too, and just making sure that we're breaking down the information and making it really clear to prospective students.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
can appear to be very black and white. Some students go, well, that's it. That's that career path ruled out instantly. And probably not
Yeah.
what they actually intended, but they can certainly be read that way, especially if it's your first time coming across those as well. Like many students will have that first time into the tertiary sector, and they'll just go, oh, this is okay, I can't argue with this. Black and white. Some professionals put this together, not me.
Yeah.
And the fear of even asking if there's anything there. So absolutely. There was another question here. Here we go. From Damala. I know this will be context specific, and this is a great question as well. But if you're identifying one thing that educators could do as a starting point, what might you suggest? Might it be go through those questions? Might it be what should I reflect on? What's one way I can start?
Do you want to
jump
go?
in? Yeah, I think even the activity of having a look at your own website with those questions in mind is really helpful. As Laura mentioned, I think for a lot of us who are working in a particular school, we might never have actually looked at that external website, and we don't know who wrote it or a lot about it because there's a bit of a disconnect there. So I think that's a really useful exercise because it allows you to see through that different lens, but yeah, identify where there are some strengths and opportunities for development.
Yep.
And I think the other thing that we could do is, as we did today in the session, imagine that you're that 17-year-old student who's never engaged with higher education before, and you're coming for the first time to look at this website. Are you going to know what to do and what to find? And will it speak to you? And will it make you feel like that's the institution or the course for you? And I think with that mindset, you can kind of start to see some of those barriers that we might overlook.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm reading. There's lots happening in chat, which is great. And so there's lots of bits happening. Thorburn's put in here, one of the things that our university would like to do, and that is wish list, is having more information about the course, i.e. videos, lab requirements, a day in the life of a student. So the student can really get a sense of what it's like to be a medical student, maybe preempt some of those questions, which leads to that, I suppose, having some of that lived experience, if many student or several students, this is what this looks like from a student perspective, kind of that, what would you wish you knew before you enrolled, 2-3 years or even 1 year on, that kind of practice. Is that something you would certainly encourage?
I think that would be great, because I know in some conversations that I've had with students who are thinking about applying for medicine, and we've been talking about supports or accommodations, and they're saying, I really don't know what I might need because I don't know what I'll actually be doing in the course and what, clinical practice looks like as a medical student. So I think those videos would be very helpful. That sounds great, Thorburn.
And I think the other thing to note is that would benefit all the other students too. Certainly students with a disability, but students who have employment responsibilities or caring responsibilities who need to be able to juggle their time with other things in their lives. Students who might have to travel to get to campus. It's helpful for them to know what the structure of the course looks like and the time requirements and the kinds of things that they'll be doing. And there's so much information that I think we could potentially be sharing, and that clarity and transparency should benefit everybody.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the hardest thing to do there, and tied this up, if only somebody would pay for that, and that's finding that time for that reflection, having time to, for our educators to go and look at, as you're saying, that enrolment process, what's in there, what's in the admissions, what are we asking? Do we need some of this, or is this just historically what we've always had? As you said, Bryony, this might have been put together by a different team altogether. So does that reflect what our expectations are as well after, these students have gotten in? So, I suppose if you picked up tips and tricks, like in the research from different institutions where you picked up some things that you go, oh, I wasn't expecting that. That's actually a really novel idea.
Well, a couple of institutions have done nice, simple things. I mean, I love the idea of a video and some, like, even social stories about what to expect, but even going lo-fi and having frequently asked questions about the enrollment process, frequently asked questions about what the course looks like and what might be required of me. I think could be a lower hanging fruit on the tree.
Yeah, what it looks like on paper or on website or on screen, should I say, may not be, how it feels, how you interact with it, how other people interact with it, what your experiences are, because you can't really capture, I suppose, those just in text on a page that's written for a different purpose, I suppose. So we're trying to make something that was written for one purpose into it needs to do more than one purpose. Just quickly looking, and of course somebody's mentioning, I'll talk about it again, on the inherent requirements front, should be accompanied by the Dean's medical inclusive guidelines in there. Absolutely. Juice has got in. Thank you so much for doing extremely important work. I love the idea of making students feel welcome already at the admission process. Do you have any thoughts on the potential complexities of doing this in a competitive context of medicine? I assume there's quite a lot of applicants who can't make it in regardless of their disability status.
It is really hard. And that's another thing that we should be perhaps just as transparent about. I know, Deakin gets many thousands of applications each year for what are about 150, 160 positions in the course. So a lot of the people looking at these pages will not be getting in. And so we can't overpromise, and we can't use language that's misleading here, but we can say, as long as we can say it truthfully, that we want a diverse range of people in our course, and that includes students with disabilities, and that includes people from rural backgrounds, and that includes Indigenous students, and we can say that, and we should be saying that up front. And I think a lot of courses do better in that space these days. But yes, we need to approach it with sensitivity and an eye to not overstating expectations.
Yep. And you said the end part of the question there as well was, is there any examples or example of institutions that addresses, you mentioned that idea of rejection on their website. Not everybody's going in, but what does that mean? Is it the end of the world? Is there other ways to apply, other times and periods and those kind of things?
That's a tricky one, isn't it? And I haven't seen anybody really do that particularly well on websites. And maybe that's changing. I know that's one thing that our outreach team are very mindful of when they present our course, when they have information sessions about the medical course. They're very, very careful to be realistic and very careful to say, this is one pathway, and we understand that it's a high preference for you, but you also need to think about what your other options would be and other alternative career trajectories would be. So again, at the core of all of this is clarity and transparency, I think.
And I might just, noting the time, I just quickly throw in one last question. Did you find anybody or anywhere that was doing like a post-admission survey of students, of them actually going through that process? Actually asking some of these questions you're asking. What was confusing? Was it clear? Yeah. Did we help or not?
We're about to get ethics through to do that study with partnership with a student society and a group of disability representatives. So that research will hopefully be coming out, and I think that'll be really important.
Fantastic, really telling. Well, I might wrap there, given the time that we're at, and I'd just ask everybody to please thank me in joining Laura and Bryony for their time and insights today, and thank you to our captioner, Sharon, for joining us. So thank you both very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
An email will be sent out shortly to everybody that's registered for today's webinar when the recording of this is available on the ADCET website, and please feel free to share that with your colleagues. We'll also have links to the documents and some of the things mentioned today on the website as well. I know some people haven't been able to access some of the PDFs that we've put directly into chat, but they will be available shortly on the website. We'd ask you to please complete a short survey on today's webinar as well, and sign up for our newsletter if you're so inclined, and links for these will be put into the chat box as well. Please save the date for an upcoming webinar that we have, and it's what we're learning, empowering disability services in the Australian higher education sector, presented by Darlene McLennan on the 25th of March, and details of that are in the chat as well. So with that, I'll say thank you, go well, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, Laura and Bryony, and to our captioner, Sharon, and to the ADCET team in the background for today's webinar. Thank you all. See you next time.